welcome to Lobby. I'm Sanya, and today we are in conversation with Advocate Aditya Srinivasan. Aditya is an NLIU Bhopal graduate, and he picked up a master's from Harvard Law School in 2016. He has worked with leading law firms across the globe, particularly Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett, and Herbert Smith Freehills. Aditya is a litigator focused on commercial securities and tax disputes, and is retained by Touchstone Partners to advise sponsors and investors of public funds. Private funds, I'm sorry. He is enrolled as an advocate with the Bar Council of Delhi and is admitted as a solicitor in England and Wales. Aditya Srinivasan is published in the Asia Pacific Tax Bulletin, the All India Federation for Tax Practitioners Journal, Mondac, and Lexology, amongst several others. He represented Rashmi Samant, the first Indian woman to have won an election to the office of President of the University of Oxford Student Union in her battle against unwarranted vilification and bullying. Rashmi was targeted particularly for her Hindu faith and identity. Hours after the election, old social media posts of hers were dug up and weaponized to target her, ultimately forcing her to resign. Recently, the investigation that was initiated following a complaint filed by Rashmi was concluded. Aditya took to Twitter to express his satisfaction with the outcome. Welcome, Aditya. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks, Anya. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I'll go straight to the case that you handled so far as Samant is concerned. And it would be really nice if you could share some light about what the sequence of events was, and from where you took it forward. What did you know in the beginning, and what do you know later, and what was it like for you?
Yeah, sure. I think Sanya, you've actually covered a lot of it in the introductory summary that you give. But why don't I just sort of add a few things here and there. As you know, Rashmi, as a student at Oxford, she wanted to, at some point of time, she wanted to contest the Oxford University Student Union election. It was one of her ambitions to give it a shot, and she knew, at the very outset, that it was going to be a long shot for her. The reason is because typically it's students who are part of the 3-year programs that generally contest these elections. Rashmi was doing a master's degree, and that was of a limited 1-year duration. So she always knew it was going to be a long shot, but she thought, fine, let me challenge myself. Let me see what I can do about this. Let me give it a shot. What do I have to lose? And so she put herself into the ring, and she cast herself into the hustings, and she entered the fray. So the campaign went on, and at the conclusion of the campaign, and by the way, I should mention that the campaign for the Oxford University Student Union election is a fairly tightly monitored campaign. There are a lot of restrictions in terms of what you can say and what you can do, how you can campaign, even things like how much funds you can use for the campaign. It's a very tightly regulated campaign with the aim of trying to keep it free and fair. And following the conclusion of that process, Rashmi was elected as president. And it so happened that she won by an enormous margin of the sorts that you typically would not see. And I think there was a lot of interest and engagement in this particular election, because I think even the turnout, if I recall correctly, was higher than you would have ordinarily seen for this sort of election in previous years. Now, shortly after she won the election, and she had become president-elect, but not quite president, because there's a bit of a time period between the two. There were some people, and we still don't know exactly who it was, but there were some people who dug up old social media posts of Rashmi from the time when she was a little girl. I mean, she's still a little girl in some ways, but I'm talking about the time when she was like 13, 14, 15, 17 years old, 18 years old. Some of those posts were dug up, and then they were essentially, as I said, weaponized in a way to make it seem as if Rashmi, the person that she was in February of 2021, still held to those views and still believed all of those things. And those views were then imputed to her. And she was then ultimately subjected to, we'll talk about this a little more, but she was subjected to a very vicious and extremely malicious campaign by her detractors, which first led to her tendering an apology, and then ultimately led to her being forced to resign as president-elect. And so ultimately, she was not able to take the office of president. Now, this is just sort of the background, and this is something which a lot of people know. But what a lot of people, and although what I'm now going to say is something that people may have heard about in the news, a lot of people don't necessarily pay attention to it. But I think it's important to emphasize what happened after this. When all of this was going on, Rashmi was constantly under severe bouts of anxiety. She was she went through a number of panic attacks. Her friends in her dorm had started to fear for what was going to happen to her. They got in touch with the NHS and they said, "Look, this is someone who needs help." And she was ultimately put in a position where she could not bear the thought of remaining in Oxford. And so she left Oxford and she first went to, she was in London for a day or two, and then she ultimately came back to India so she could be with her family and with her well-wishers and friends. She spent some time she spent some time in India, as you know, and she herself has gone on the media on a number of occasions to talk about this. She spent some time in the hospital as well, and finally, when she felt like she was in a, when she had recovered to an extent, and she felt like she could return to Oxford, she did. And one of the things that was at the back of her mind was these people who came after me, these people who put up a number of malicious posts and undertook this vicious campaign and targeted campaign against me. I don't want to let them get away. I want to at least take some action against them. I don't know if it's going to result in an outcome which I like or don't like, but let me at least not give off the impression that I'm taking this lying down. That was the basis on which she came, and then she filed a complaint. It was during that stage when I got involved in it. There were a number of people, as you know, Sania, who had extended their support to her. And she had expressed her wish to some of these people that she wanted someone who's familiar with the legal system in the UK, in England, to sort of advise her independently, and that's sort of how I came on board, and then we took the process forward.
Right. So I want to understand whether most of this targeted harassment that she faced, was it restricted to social media, or did she also have to deal with it outside of social media? Did she also have to deal with it in the university campus, or what was it like? I mean, somebody calling her, messaging her, some sort of messages, or was it only restricted to cyberbullying?
Right, that's a great question, Sania. And I think yes, a lot of it was focused on social media, but there were instances, of course, where there were maybe the word I should use is sort of offline. There was some incidents of offline harassment, and not all of these were necessarily direct. In a lot of cases, look, Rashmi is someone, she made herself a sort of a public entity in Oxford, and she was, if you ever met with her, if you ever spoke with her, you'd know instantly that she's a very outgoing person. She's a gregarious personality. She loves to talk. And what happened for a period of time was that because of these events, suddenly she was sort of cut off from society in Oxford. There were a lot of people, of course, there were some people who were friends who were always willing to talk to her, but in terms of the larger Oxford community, I think there were a lot of people who they were put in a position where they didn't entirely feel comfortable talking with her. And I think that's that's one of the unfortunate outcomes of this targeted bullying campaign. Having said that, yes, a lot of it was on social media. I have seen some of the replies and messages and DMs that she's received about the things that people have said, and it's very unfortunate.
Absolutely. And so it's safe to say that she was targeted for her belief system, for her background. So it's safe to say that, correct?
Well, I think there were multiple phases of how the campaign went about. Firstly, you're absolutely right. Yes, her faith, her belief system, her opinions, the part of the country where she's from, the state that she belongs to, all of these were aspects of the bullying, but it went through multiple phases. First, it was the various posts that were dredged up from the past. That became the first point of the campaign, and then there was a post by Dr. Abhijit Sarkar, which is now, I think, infamous, in which he has identified certain aspects of Rashmi's identity and of her faith and of her opinions and of her education of all things and the region of the state that she belongs to, which were then sort of taken up and constituted the second phase of the bullying campaign and that was launched in Rashmi's direction. So there were multiple aspects to it. Obviously, the one that's sort of caught most attention and it rightfully so, because it was this that really affected her and got to her, because she found that her identity and things that were very, very close and intimate to her had been weaponized. So these were the things that you mentioned, such as her identity, her faith, her opinions, her region, the state of the country that she belonged to, her place of education, Manipal Institute of Technology, etc. These were the things that were really weaponized, and they were so close to her that they had a real impact on Rashmi.
Right. So, and I mean, when you first spoke about this, and we were having a conversation about having a talk, I remember that you said that she finally did go back and she did want to take some action against the people who targeted her, who harassed her. And when that happened, you said that this was an internal investigation which was set up to handle the entire case. Now, I have some understanding of internal investigations, at least from an Indian perspective. But I also want to understand how things work there in the UK, especially in terms of the universities, such as Oxford, these prestigious universities. Is it like a uniform process that they follow when a case like this happens? Or what is it like? How does it proceed there?
Sure, that's a great question, Sanya. So, look, I think to a certain extent, you'll find that a lot of universities will try and have a sort of tailored, bespoke approach to how they undertake these investigations. But largely, you'll find that there are certain aspects which you could consider to be universal across the board. So, for example, we speak frequently in this country about principles of natural justice. We speak as frequently about it in other jurisdictions, including the UK. And there were some elements of that. So, for example, Rashmi provided a statement. Her statement was taken down. It was interrogated. The counterparty or the person against whom the statement was made was allowed to provide their views and provide their replies and responses, etc. And all of this was done. And then, having received all of these views, I believe the investigator has considered it and then produced a report to the committee, which ultimately, took the decision and provided the outcome of the decision. So I think some of these aspects you would expect would tend to be universal across the board. Yes, I think every university will try and have some sort of tailored, bespoke aspects in their procedures, just because in some cases some of these institutions go back hundreds and hundreds of years, so they've sort of. I'm not saying that they've never updated their procedures, but they feel that there might be some merit to sort of retaining certain aspects of their procedures. One aspect of the procedure which I'll actually mention is which I did not like, frankly, is that when Rashmi is asked to sit down and speak to the investigator, and the investigator takes down her statement, as per the procedure, she's allowed to bring certain categories of people. She's allowed to have certain categories of people to accompany her for that process. So she's allowed to have someone from the university staff or someone from the community. Now, we had asked that Rashmi be allowed to have a solicitor present when this happened, which our request was frankly rejected. I thought that was unfortunate, and we provided what I think was a fairly good explanation for why it was important to have her solicitor present, which was that given the nature of what had happened, given the facts and circumstances of the case surrounding Rashmi, and given the specific context of Rashmi having been elected to the Oxford University Students' Union, and given that she was a public figure, we felt that a lot of people might not necessarily be willing to come forward to accompany her, and frankly, Rashmi might not also be comfortable asking a lot of people to come and do this for her, given that she knows given that she knows the contours of the case in question. So we had requested that a solicitor should be present, but they had refused it. And the question was whether we wanted to do something about that particular procedural issue. And I think ultimately we decided that let's given that we are working with limited time, let's just have her give the statement to the investigator by herself, and let's push the process forward rather than trying to do something at a procedural level.
Right. And how much time did this really take, this entire process, and since the beginning? How much time was it supposed to take?
Tanya, from the time that Rashmi contacted or initiated the procedure, which is to say that she wrote a communication and said that I want to do something about this, till the time we got the ultimate result, I would say it has been I would say easily 3.5 months between that date and the date that we got the outcome. Now, the investigation itself might have taken place over a shorter period of time, and the lead up to the investigation actually taking place would have also taken up some time. And ultimately, the committee that had to rule on the report that had been received from the investigator also took us a period of time. So, but overall, the process took around 3.5 months.
All right, right. So this is a bit of a deviation, just a general question. I want to understand, you've studied abroad and you've worked abroad.
Right.
And, it would be nice to know whether you think harassment of people from, say, India, or from a specific belief system, or people of a specific color, I mean, all those aspects. Do you think this is commonplace abroad, especially, say, in the UK or the US? What would you say about that? Do you think this happens very commonly, or what is it like?
Yeah, sure. I think what we've seen over the last, I would say actually 5 to 10 years is a lot. There are a lot more of these incidents that are being reported and are surfacing in the media, and has led to a lot of social organization. You've seen a lot of activity and campaigning organized around some of these events. Now, to an extent, I think this is a function of the fact that these events are occurring maybe a little more frequently. I think this is also a function of the fact that whilst these events have probably always been occurring, it's now being spoken about more. It's now being taken a lot more seriously. I think these are probably like the two broad trends. Now, do I think that these events happen? Yes, they definitely do. You will see, you will come across these events when you read the news, and when you watch the TV, as well as when you go on social media. And I think if any one of these events, if any of these events takes place, it's one too many. With respect to the Indian community in general, because I want to speak about that, since I've been a part of the Indian community in 2 different countries, at least 2 different countries, apart from India as well. I think, I've said this before as well on television, but I think it's important. It bears repeating again. The Indian community in general across the world is a very well-behaved community. It's a very contributing community. They like to go about their business. They like to be productive to the societies in which they form a part. And unfortunately, I think what this has led to is that a lot of other communities, I think, tend to look upon the Indian community as being easy fodder. They think it's okay to be able to ride roughshod over the Indian community when it comes to matters of identity, when it comes to matters of faith. And I think that's extremely unfortunate. And we've seen some incidents of this. Of course, we've seen the sort of incident which immediately now comes to light, given what has happened is Rashmi's case. I think that perhaps best exemplifies what I'm saying. But there've been a number of other incidents, I think, as well across the world, and certainly in the UK and in the US, in this regard as well. And as I said, even one of these incidents taking place, I think, is frankly unfortunate. Right.
And were there challenges that you had to face when you were doing this? When you were handling this, especially since I remember this became a very heated issue from the Indian point of view, and the news was all over it. Our external affairs minister also got involved in it, and he supported the whole idea. So, as a lawyer, from a lawyer's perspective, and that happens, what are the challenges that you tend to face, or is there pressure then, or how do you feel about it? How did you feel about it really?
I'll be completely honest, Sanya. I did not personally come under any sort of pressure, apart from the pressure that I felt that my client Rashmi should have a favorable outcome. That was possibly the only pressure I felt. And I think one of the things that we agreed on, Rashmi and I agreed on very early on, is that we're not going to talk about the fact that she's retained counsel publicly, until we get to the stage where we actually have an outcome. So I was very insistent that we don't put this out in the public, until much later. And I think for a lot of people realized only when I put out those tweets that Rashmi actually had a lawyer, had a solicitor who was advising her, and that's exactly the way I wanted to keep it. One of the reasons for which was this. I did not want to come under pressure. I wanted it to be a fairly silent process, a fairly quiet process. I did not want anyone to try and influence how my engagement with Rashmi was going to work. In fact, and to be fair, that's also what Rashmi wanted. She wanted to be advised independently. She wanted someone to advise her independently. And I said the way to retain that independence is to sort of keep quiet about it, until we get to a much later stage. So yes, there were, from time to time, various senior persons, in the government took up the they took up the matter. It wasn't just Mr. Jaishankar. I think there were a number of other people, not necessarily in government, but also I suppose in the general political way who had expressed their support. And this includes people in India as well as people in the UK. I think one of the Tory members of Parliament, Bob Blackburn, if I'm not mistaken, had also expressed his support in some regard. Let me also mention the Chief Minister of Karnataka, B.S. Yediyurappa, who'd also written a letter of support, given that Rashmi is, after all, a resident of the state of which she is the Chief Minister. So there was support from various quarters. But with respect to your other question of whether there was pressure or not, I think we were able to handle it in a way such that there wasn't a lot of pressure. And that, frankly, that discipline, I think, gave us a lot of flexibility and freedom in terms of how we operated and how we went about the process.
Right. And going back to the investigation now, since there was a fixed procedure in place and you had to follow that, did you ever contemplate taking another route or taking legal action in their courts or anything? Was there any other side to this?
I'll tell you something. It was always at the back of our minds. And like I said, there were a lot of people, behind Rashmi. A lot of people were supporting her, and a lot of them had, a lot of the British Hindu community in the UK had already, I think, they'd filed police complaints or criminal complaints or whatnot, and they had tried to push the process forward, through that alternative route already. Between Rashmi and myself, obviously, we were also discussing and we were thinking of what other opportunities or what other remedies we could take recourse to, should we not, should this not go the way we wanted to. Yes, it was something that we were thinking in terms of.
Right. You mentioned Mr. Sarkar in the beginning. You said that he a specific post and it became, we all know about that post.
Yes.
So, did you ever feel like I'm just understanding your perspective on this. Did you ever feel like, this is a professor and there's a certain way that this professor should behave? Do you think that professors should be allowed to express their personal views, should be allowed to ideologically have opinions on social media? I'm only coming from the point of view of, because this point of view I want to put forward from your side, because this has been going on. This is a raging debate on social media nowadays. So teachers and professors have been on social media and they've had their own inklings to say what they want to say, and that's absolutely fine. It's their right to do so. But to what extent do you think this should be allowed? Because they are also in a space where they have to, be neutral. They have to teach students. They're not supposed to give out only one point of view, because after all, it's teaching. What do you think about this?
Look, Sanya, I think it's possibly fair to say that maybe you and I sort of grew up in roughly the sort of same time period, and we've seen in the colleges that we attended, we've seen the sort of professors that we had, and we know that some of them, I know, for example, that a lot of my professors held certain views, which they would sometimes express in the classroom, which sometimes they would express outside of the classroom, and I personally don't think it's a problem at all for a professor to express a certain political leaning or an ideological view. And frankly, I think, I know that a lot of people might instantly disagree with me when I say this, but I think the fact that someone is willing to represent their view actually makes them perhaps more transparent. But having said that, there needs to be a line drawn between expressing a political view and then applying that political view, or applying that ideological leaning in a way that ends up targeting your students, or initiating or encouraging a bullying or harassment campaign against your students. There's a very vast difference between the two things. It's one thing to say, for example, that I disagree with XYZ policy of ABC government for the following reasons, ABC, because it doesn't align with my ideology, and it's a completely different thing, Sanya, to then say that because you student do not agree with my point of view, I will ensure that you become the subject of a very public humiliation. It's the latter act that we have a problem with. And if you speak to Rashmi, she'll tell you exactly the same thing. Now, the gentleman in question, Dr. Abhijit Sarkar, he had put up some posts on social media, one of which, again, is something which has caught a lot of media attention. Because his I think it's his Instagram profile. If I'm not mistaken, it remains public. This particular post is now deleted, but it existed at one point of time, where he put up a post about how he enjoyed breaking idols of goddess Saraswati when he was a child. Now, of course, a lot of practicing Hindus would have a problem with that from the get-go. But if that's something that he just wants to express as his personal view, then fine, he's free to do it, and people will judge him or not judge him for that view. But when you take that into consideration, along with the manner in which he targeted Rashmi, then that's the part that becomes really, really worrying, because it appears, it's very clear that he's got some sort of anti-Hindu bias and anti-Hindu hatred, which has resulted in him saying the horrible things that he said about Rashmi and her parents and her faith and her identity. So I think to sort of go back to your question, is it a problem for professors or people in academia to express their ideological leanings or their political leanings? Personally, I don't think it's a problem. It only becomes a problem when these leanings and when these views are used to when it affects the teaching or the instruction between the professor or the teacher and the student. That's when it becomes a problem, according to me. And this particular case with Dr. Sarkar is a fine example of that.
You've also touched upon something that I had in mind in my list of questions, something called cancel culture.
Yes.
So I want to read out what Rashmi had written in one of her pieces for Times of India. She says, "It has become personalized witch hunt and aims to permanently destroy the character and prospects of those who fail or choose not to conform to political correctness and unreasonable bookish insanity." So in light of this, do you think the entire incident was only an outcome of cancel culture? And also, if you think that it has suddenly become a very major issue, which we see going around, I also want to say that recently there was a Madras High Court judge who delivered a brilliant judgment on LGBTQ issues, and he was targeted because of his identity, his religious identity. So what is going on? I mean, how do we tackle this? Do you think there's something legally we could do about it? I'm a little confused about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Sanya. And I think that the existence of the cancel culture is probably what ultimately a lot of the things about this case comes down to. Yes, there is a cancel culture. Yes, it's now become extremely prevalent, certainly on both sides of the Atlantic, but I think also increasingly you'll find in Indian universities in various parts of this country. I think it really took off in a massive way. I would say around maybe 2015, early 2016 in the US. And I mean, it had obviously there'd been a number of incidents of canceling prior to that as well. But 2015, 2016 is when it really sort of took up and took off in a major way. I say this because, I mean, one, I was in the US at the time, and two, it was in the run up to that very acrimonious presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where the left wing of the Democratic Party got animated in a very, very significant way. And these were the sort of things that came to pass. Now I know, for instance, I was at Harvard at the time, and there were at least 2 or 3 instances when there were events and there were protests and campaigns that were undertaken with respect to cancellation. And the thing with cancellation is, and this is what I find deeply problematic about it, is that it requires you to subscribe to a particular point of view. And if you don't subscribe to that point of view, then you're in deep trouble. You can either choose to remain silent. You can pretend as if you don't have an opinion. Maybe you genuinely don't have an opinion about it. But even not having an opinion about it might be viewed as problematic because because some of the more activated of the cancel culture lot will say, how can you not have an opinion about this? How can you not stand up for or oppose this particular thing? So that also becomes problematic, and it forces someone to take a position. Now, there has been, and Sanya, you'll probably be aware of this as well, Sanya, that there's been a lot of now scholarship that has emerged about cancel culture and about cancellation and why people take positions. And I think people should read it. People should definitely read it and make themselves familiar with it, and it's important to do it. But at an instinctive level, I think the problem with it is that it forces someone to take a view, and it forces you to subscribe to a particular point of view. And there sometimes are no principles guiding the position that one has to take. Mm-hmm. Now, the consequences of cancel culture are all too known, and they're being seen increasingly, I think. One is now people are becoming increasingly afraid to speak. 2, people are becoming afraid to voice their opinions. 3, this idea of a marketplace of ideas, which is particularly what an academic institution needs to be, is being whittled down in a very unfortunate manner. And there are a number of consequences, a number of other consequences as well. But I think these are the top 3 ones that it really has a chilling effect on speech and on opinions. Now, obviously, the counter view that people will take is that, look, there are some views that just should not be expressed and cannot be expressed. But the question is, when do you draw the line, and what is the principle on which you draw the line between what is okay to say and what is not okay to say? And I think until that question is answered in a meaningful way, and frankly, I don't think that question has been answered anywhere in the world. But until that question is answered in a meaningful way, I don't think cancel culture is something that one can really be comfortable with, or one can subscribe to. And frankly, I think, particularly in an academic institution, it's important to have an exchange of all ideas. It's important for it to be a free marketplace of ideas. And I think the quality of an academic education will depreciate if you have more incidents of cancellation and more incidents of cancel culture. And this is true not just in the US or the UK, but wherever else it happens in the world, including in India.
Absolutely. I think the timeline that you've mentioned, 2015, 2016, definitely, I think that was around the time when, these issues started coming up more. And before that, I remember when I was in college, when I was in school, these issues, I mean, we never used to even talk about a lot of things that now people are talking about online, and people are hating on each other online. So it has become very commonplace now in the last few years. Now, coming to the perspective of when you'd mentioned Dr. S. Jaishankar had supported this cause, and when he did, to what extent was the government involved in this entire issue? I'd like to understand that. And were there any specific instructions that really had come forward from them, or to what extent were they involved with this?
So I'm, Sania, to be completely honest, I'm only aware of the statement that was made by Dr. S. Jayashankar. I'm not aware of, whether there was anything else done by any of the other ministers of the government or anyone else in the, in the ministries or the departments who said or did anything. Now, if something has happened, if there's been some sort of a back channeling, if someone has interacted with their counterparts in the UK, it may or may not have happened. I'm not aware of if anything along those lines happened. I did mention, as I said, that the Chief Minister of Karnataka had written a letter of support. And there were some other people, I think some other political figures in India who had expressed their support. But from a government perspective, if something had happened, I'm not aware of it.
Correct. And so, I mean, you handle a case like this now. Right. You've completely given assistance and you've done legal work for her in this particular regard. So if some student were to face harassment like this on social media, or bullying like this on social media, what do you suggest? What is your advice to them? What do you think they should be doing? Maybe from an Indian point of view, who do they go to? How do they proceed?
Yeah, I think naturally the laws of various jurisdictions are different, and India has her set of laws, and the UK has its set of laws. I think, but from a practical perspective, I think the most important thing for someone to do when they become the subject of the sort of a humiliation or bullying or harassment campaign is to document. It's very important to document your various evidences and store them safely, because I tell you, Sania, once when you undertake this sort of a thorough documentation process, the documents will themselves sort of write the case for you in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. Documents will sort of suggest exactly the kind of offense that is committed, or the kind of law, the kind of remedies that will be available to you if you meticulously sort of maintain a record of what's happening. I mean, so take your screenshots and save the documents and save all of these instances. For example, I'll give you this example with Dr. Sarkar himself. He had deleted the original post that he had put up, in which he had in which he had targeted Rashmi's identity and her faith and her parents, etc. But a screenshot had been taken like before he had deleted it, and so therefore we have that in evidence, and we know exactly what was said. Similarly, I told you about the post in which he boasts about breaking idols of Goddess Saraswati, and similarly a screenshot has been taken of that post along with the English translation. So my main recommendation to anyone who is a subject of bullying or harassment is to document the evidence of it. Now, I want to be clear. I know that when you become the subject of public humiliation in this way, the first thing in your mind is not necessarily that you need to keep a record of the things that have happened against you, but it is something that I nevertheless recommend, that as soon as you're able to gather your bearings, it's important to keep a document, to keep a record of the things that have been said about you and the people who have said these things about you, because that will suggest the course of action and the remedies that need to be taken.
Right. And the decision I remember came on the July 16th. And how much detail can you give me about this, Aditya? What really was the outcome of the case? And I mean, what were the details in this case? What was the outcome really like? How much details can you really disclose to us?
Sania, not very much, I'm afraid. I can say what I've already said before, which is that I'm pleased with the outcome of the investigation. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of people would like me to get into more detail about exactly what the university has said, what the committee has held, which of the allegations, etc., have been upheld and whatnot. But I think in Rashmi's best interests, it's important that I sort of confine myself to what I've said, which is that a decision has been taken, and what I mean to say is that the investigation has been concluded. We have seen the report, and I am pleased with the contents of the report.
Right.
Believe me, I would like to, and not just me, Rashmi herself, myself, and all of her supporters would really like to get into the substance of the report and talk about it and say exactly what and basically disclose the contents of the report, if not the entire report, if we could. But we're not going to do that at this stage, and it's a call that Rashmi and I have taken together, and we believe it's in her best interest to confine ourselves to what we've said.
Right. So Rashmi jotted down a piece a couple of days back. It says, it's titled "A Rose That Grew from a Crack in the Concrete." What was your experience like about the entire issue? And was this the first case that you took up so far as harassment, bullying, something of this sort is concerned?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because as in fact you said in your introductory remarks, I am very much a dyed-in-the-wool commercial tax sort of lawyer, and like a case of this sort is not the sort that would ordinarily come my way, or the one that I would ordinarily take. But every now and then I do like to take up a matter of this sort, which has like a public interest element to it. And my sort of yardstick for taking up a case of this sort is that two conditions need to be met. One, the person who brings the case to me needs to really believe in it, whether it's the client themselves or the person who's referring the case really needs to believe in taking up the case. And then the second condition is that I also have to believe in the particular cause that's being taken up. So whilst I don't generally do this sort of a case, if something like this does come up, if a public interest sort of case of this sort does come up, I will consider it. And in the same vein, there are a few other things I've taken up, and maybe some of these will make the news, maybe some of these will not make the news, and if they do, I'll be happy to have a chat with you, Sania, when that comes up. Now, with respect to this particular case itself, as I said to you in response to one of your earlier questions, I was not under any pressure at all, and full credit to Rashmi for that. I think we've both been practitioners in the legal field, and we both come across clients who can be slightly more involved, slightly more agitated, slightly more animated in terms of what they expect. But I think Rashmi has been like largely mature, and she's sort of like given me a lot of freedom in that respect with respect to how we go about the case and how we deal with it. So I was never under any pressure. Yes, I mean, sort of there are some things in terms of like the usual client handling in sort of dealing with Rashmi, in sort of allaying her concerns and giving her assurances in terms of what needs to be done and how to take particular steps forward. And I think we sort of dealt with all of that well. Of course, the finest testament testimony I got, Sania, at the end of it was what Rashmi said when she put up the tweet saying, "Couldn't have asked for a better lawyer." I mean, as a lawyer, frankly, I can't ask for anything else. That's a great testimony, and I'm very, very grateful to her for her kind words in that respect.
Right, Aditya. I guess that's about it. I think it was great to speak with you about this. And I just want to thank you for taking our time on a Sunday, especially to speak with us and giving us some good perspective about this entire issue. Thank you very much. And we're very glad to have you here today with us. Thank you.
No, likewise, Sania. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope to sit down with you on one of these issues again at some point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. A recorded version of this is going to be available on our YouTube channel.